Ben Cross joins me. NBC Sports' Ben Cross. It's been a while, Ben. First of all, I appreciate you joining me
Yes.
on the show today. But let me ask you, Ben, because I don't want to waste too much time here, and I wanted to get your reaction. Drew Brees last night or yesterday announced his retirement from the NFL. I thought it was only fitting that he allowed his kids to deliver that message on Instagram Live. I thought that was a really beautiful moment for him, and we knew that there was all this speculation surrounding when and if he would retire, and he finally did. What was your reaction to his retirement? And just when you think of Drew Brees and the indelible mark that he's left with the Saints and on the NFL, what do you think of him as a player and just on the announcement that he's retiring?
The news wasn't necessarily shocking. I mean, you went into the final games of that last season and obviously his game against Brady in the playoffs, and the expectation was a loss was ultimately going to mean the last game of his career. I think the big question was what was taking him so long into the offseason. I suppose we don't exactly know that, but I did think it was a nice moment. It's not all that surprising. And I will say he is ending his career as an NFL football player, but he is beginning his career as an NBC sports analyst and joining the NBC family. So we are very happy to have him as part of that group. But I will say he has one of those legacies that I think will be ultimately overlooked. If you look at his stats, he will ultimately be in almost every great quarterback conversation you want to have. He traded off stats for touchdowns, yards with Peyton and Tom Brady. You name it, he's up there. I think he's an absolute class act of a person and a class act of a football player. But I think it was time. You look at him in this last year, maybe 2 years, the arm strength just hasn't necessarily been there, and he's had to put the ball down the field with great talent. But ultimately, the team was winning without him when he was injured, and it just seemed like he was getting to the end of the road, and he walked away gracefully. So a great career. Sorry to see him leave, but I think it ultimately was the right time for Drew Brees.
Now, I said this, the mere fact to me that the Seattle Seahawks transitioning to the Seahawks, the mere fact that the Seahawks even were listening to trade inquiries and calls about Russell Wilson told me everything I need to know. Because if you're adamant about not trading a quarterback or a player is totally indispensable, a la the Houston Texans and Deshaun Watson, believe me, you'll make sure that there are not any rumors that your player is going to be traded. And I thought that it was really just a bad look. And I understand that the Seahawks are trying to mend and patch the relationship with him, that they're looking at offensive linemen. But to me, Ben, I don't know if it's irreparable, because I just don't think that if your guy is truly your franchise quarterback. I mean, imagine someone calling the Kansas City Chiefs to inquire about Patrick Mahomes. If they even picked up the phone, that's a mistake. What's your thoughts on the latest surrounding Russell Wilson? Do you think that the Seahawks are taking the right approach here, or that they really shouldn't even be interested at all in accepting phone calls for this guy?
Well, they absolutely should be interested. I think it's been clear over the last few years that Russell isn't necessarily entirely happy. Even he listed teams. I mean, he said, I am not necessarily interested in leaving, but if I were to leave, these are the teams that I'd be interested in. And that kind of got this whole thing rolling. I mean, don't get me wrong. I don't necessarily believe that the Seahawks leaked that they were interested in calling, but they actually should receive calls. I think it's clear that Russell isn't winning them a Super Bowl every year. And as talented as he is, I think they need to start thinking in another direction. I think he also needs to start thinking in another direction. I don't necessarily think there's bad blood in the relationship, but I do think, much like Brady and the Patriots had, it might just be time for each party to move apart. I still think ultimately he'll stay there this year, but I think you look at it right now, and the Seahawks absolutely should be fielding calls because he's going to have a tremendous value. And if the Seahawks are looking to pave a new path, if they unload Russell Wilson, ultimately they could take that new path in a very quick manner. So I think they absolutely should be fielding calls. I think it's unfortunate that that information leaked, whether that was purposeful or not. Certainly doesn't help the situation. But I think they absolutely should be picking up the phone. Patrick Mahomes is a different conversation. But I think they should be. I think the Texans should be fielding more calls than the Seahawks, however, because Deshaun Watson absolutely does not want to be there, whereas Russell Wilson, I think, still would like to be in Seattle if he can make it work and they can support him and not ultimately lead to as many sacks as he takes in a year.
Yeah, it's just interesting to me because, again, I just think that what Russell Wilson means to this organization, and it's not like they're high enough in the draft order, Ben, to now maybe granted, depending on the trade partner, they'd be able to get high enough in the draft to select a quarterback. That's certainly possible. But given their situation, I just don't love the optics of it. Not to mention, not only are you dealing your franchise quarterback and you have to go into a rebuild, but you'd also have to eat $39 million in cap space, in dead cap money. So I'm not exactly sure, but I just thought it was a little bit of a mistake to even listen to it. But that's just me. But let me say this. Let me transition to the Green Bay Packers. So I actually thought that finally, for one of the first times in a long time, they actually made a prudent investment in re-signing Aaron Jones, because to me, this was more than just re-signing Aaron Jones. This killed two birds with one stone. You re-sign Aaron Jones, who's a talented running back, but I think you also alleviate some of the concerns of Aaron Rodgers. I thought that the Packers organization, in a certain sense, felt indebted and obligated to Aaron Rodgers this offseason to sign some guys, to spend some money and not be frugal, given that they didn't draft any impact players for him last season. What say you on the decision for the Green Bay Packers to sign Aaron Jones to that big-time contract yesterday?
I think it's a good decision and a good move. I think they paid him too much, but beside that, I think it was a good move. I don't necessarily think it's going to alleviate a ton of Rodgers' concerns, though, because he still needs weapons. Obviously, he is one of the best receivers in the NFL. I think there's no question about that. But I think he wants more than that. And I don't necessarily believe a running back completely alleviates those concerns. Don't get me wrong. When you saw the Packers at their best, they were extremely balanced, and their run game led the way, and then Rodgers would close these drives. So I don't necessarily believe that it's a bad in any shape or form, but I don't necessarily think it's the only move they need to take in order to give Rodgers confidence that they want him well down the line. I still think he's going to be thinking about the future in the next few years here, and I don't necessarily think that was the final nail in the coffin. I do believe it was a big step, though, because the Packers, as they have proven, need to have a balanced running attack if they're also going to give Rodgers the opportunities to just abuse defenses, which he has.
So I'm going to reveal my bracket predictions on Wednesday before Thursday. So on Wednesday's show. Obviously, we know that March Madness Selection Sunday took place yesterday. Now, I will be the first to admit, it almost seems like college basketball just kind of flew under the radar this year and just kind of all of a sudden arrived, and we're already at March Madness, even though it's crazy that it's been over 2 years. It's been 2 years since we had March Madness. And to me, when I looked at the number one overall seeds, again, I don't have too many issues, although I did think that it was interesting that Michigan received the number one overall seed, not because they're not necessarily worthy, but I would have liked to have seen them beat Ohio State in the semis of the Big Ten tournament and at least advance to the finals. To me, that would have solidified. The fact that they lost to the Buckeyes, I thought maybe a team like Alabama that won the SEC might have been a little bit more deserving of that nod for the number one seed. I don't have too many gripes, though. Were you surprised by anything from yesterday, or did it pretty much pan out the way that you expected?
I wasn't too surprised. And I think if you look at that Michigan-Bama debate, I understand the argument to put Bama at a one seed, but I think if you compare them to Michigan specifically, Michigan in that Ohio State game you mentioned had Isaiah Livers out. He's still out indefinitely. And they also had Franz Wagner out. Those are two of their better players. And they went up against one of those strong Big Ten teams. And if you look at the Big Ten schedule, it is far, far superior and far harder than anything Bama faced this year. I think if you look at Bama, they actually worry me in this tournament a little bit. I don't necessarily see them just breezing past possibly a matchup with UConn even in the second round, because I think you look at them this year, they haven't really played anyone all that strong. They were the only ranked team in the SEC for a large period of time. They had 2 losses in the SEC, but they had 4 losses in non-conference. That's a lot of losses to put on the slate before you enter a pretty easy schedule in the SEC. So I'm not necessarily sold on Bama. I do like them, and I think they made a case to be a number one seed. But against Michigan, Michigan had such a strong year. They beat so many great teams, and they very rarely looked like they had any weaknesses. And considering the fact that they had one of their best players out against Ohio State in one of their 3 losses, I believe, on the entire season, I think they absolutely deserve the bid over Bama. I think if you look at the rest of the bracket, not too many surprises. I think the committee, for whatever reason, actually did a great job this year. I think you look at a lot of the bubble teams, not too many people were all that upset. I know there were a few non-Power 5, non-major conference teams that had strong resumes from a win-loss perspective, but they didn't necessarily have the strength of schedule, and they got left out. So I think the committee did a smart thing there. I think you're going to look at the play-in games. Michigan State got in off the bubble. UCLA, your Bruins, got in off the bubble. Syracuse got in off the bubble as also an 11 seed. Those teams are all very interesting. I know a lot of people are going to pick them in the 11-6 matchups. So those will be interesting to watch as we approach Thursday. I think it was a good bracket. I think it's going to be really interesting to see how the quarantining affects teams. UVA, for instance, has one player that's going to be out for the tournament. They haven't announced 2. They're not even going to meet as a team until Friday, and they play on Saturday when they're traveling the day before. A lot of these teams can't even meet until Thursday, Friday. That's going to be an interesting dynamic that we really don't know how it's going to affect these teams. If you look at the actual matchups on the bracket, though, I think it's going to be a very top-heavy tournament. I think they did a great job in the top 16 teams, 1 through 4 seeds, and see 3, 1, and 2 seeds in the Final Four. And you always got to account for a potential wild card getting into the Final Four. But at least right now, I think if you look at the top teams, they're dominant. I think you wonder about Michigan's health, but I think Gonzaga, Illinois, and Baylor are very strong teams, and I'd be very surprised if one of those teams wasn't competing for the title this year.
And not to mention that Tony Bennett has actually come out and publicly acknowledged that their tournament is a little bit in flux right now, given all the guys that are in quarantine right now. And it's certainly going to be interesting. I am excited. I think part of it too is that there's been less controversy surrounding college basketball this year because I think just there's been less viewership. So I think overall there's kind of people kind of haven't had that many arguments because they haven't been following as much this year, even though I do love college basketball. And let me ask you my final question, because I want to transition to our team, the Wisconsin Badgers. Now, of course, I will admit that UCLA is my second team. And I think that matchup versus Michigan State is absolutely fascinating. And I think the winner of that matchup will beat BYU. I don't have any questions about that. That regardless, if it's Michigan State, if it's UCLA, I think they'll beat BYU. But let's transition. Wisconsin, our alma mater, is playing your hometown, North Carolina Tar Heels. I know this has got to be eating at you, Ben, because initially for me, I thought the report was that Wisconsin was going to play UCLA, and I was having a hard time focusing on the road when I saw that notification. I wasn't sure what I was going to do. You've had to experience this before watching Wisconsin and North Carolina. What are your emotions like going to be going into this game, and who are you going to be rooting for on Friday?
Well, I'll ultimately have to pull for Wisconsin. I would say it was a moment of shock, but not necessarily the most surprising thing I've seen. My senior year of high school, after I'd gotten into Wisconsin played UNC in the Sweet 16. That was a huge matchup. It brings back a lot of those emotions. My family is very much behind UNC, so I'm rowing my own boat on this one. I think if you look at the matchup specifically, it is a scary matchup for Wisconsin, but I think it's going to be a close game either way. It really is a tale of two different styles of play. UNC loves to get out and run. They love to get in transition. They have a very dominant down inside the paint game. They have 3 guys who are 6'11", who are absolutely dominant on the boards. They're the number 1 offensive rebounding team in the country, whereas Wisconsin is one of the worst rebounding teams in the country. They love to shoot threes. They love to slow down the pace, play time of possession. They don't turn the ball over very much. They're the number 1 turnover team in the country, and UNC turns the ball over a ton. So it's going to be a really, really interesting matchup. I can't exactly tell you who's going to win. I think it's a pick 'em right now in the Vegas perspective of things. Ultimately, I think UNC has a slight edge. I'll be pulling for Wisconsin, but either way, should be a great matchup. I know a lot of people are probably going to be fading the heels a little bit. We'll see. Certainly interesting approaching Friday night.
Not to mention, both of those teams are kind of heading in opposite directions. Wisconsin is 17-12, but they've lost like they've lost like 5 out of their last 11 games, and they've lost like eight games against ranked teams recently, 3 times to Iowa, twice to Illinois, once to Michigan, once to Ohio State, once to Purdue, and North Carolina, 18-10. They've kind of finished in the opposite direction. They've won 10 of their last 15 games. They're playing really well, so that one should be a really exciting matchup. Well, Ben, thank you so much as always for joining me.
Always great to be
on. I'll be thinking about you on Friday when the lead changes, what you're going to be rooting for. I'll probably be texting you throughout the entire night.
I'm sure we'll be talking.
Hopefully you can keep your emotions in check, and we'll catch up again soon.
No promises there. All right. Thanks, John.